Saucy Jacky by Doug Lamoreux, and I decided to give this one a read. And in this episode, I'm going to look at how he chose to portray Jack the Ripper. Now, this book is a novel, and there are other novels out there that explore Jack the Ripper's mindset, if you will. Earlier this year on the channel, I talked to you guys a lot about I, Ripper by Stephen Hunter, and that is again a first-person narrative about what Jack the Ripper was thinking when he committed the crimes. And I read I, Ripper, and overall I had a good experience with it, even if I didn't agree with all of Stephen Hunter's observations, or I had a lot of doubts about how he chose to characterize certain aspects of the Whitechapel mysteries. But then I decided to pick up the autobiography of Jack the Ripper by James Carnac, and that book is absolutely different. That book is something that is pretending to be a historical document. It's almost a mock autobiography of Jack the Ripper, if you will. But the fact that they were trying to pass it off as something authentic just left a sour taste in my mouth. But in all seriousness, there are no shortage of stories and books about Jack the Ripper and how people choose to profile the Ripper, which brings us to today's episode. And I want to look at what Doug Lamoreux thought of Jack the Ripper. And again, you can weigh in the comments section down below. And I also want to be very clear that very frequently on Ripper Wednesday, I talk to you guys about the suspects. But in this episode, let's look at what Jack the Ripper may have been like. And let's look at a possible profile. The first thing from the book Saucy Jacky by Doug Lamoreux is he expected that the Ripper was in his 30s. No specific age is given for the character, but it's all actually given as a first-person narrative in Saucy Jacky. He just says in his 30s, so that means between age 30 and age 39. Jack the Ripper would have been 5.5 feet tall, so approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall, give or take. What do you think about that? I mean, firstly, let's address these 2 points. In his 30s and 5 feet 6 inches tall. If anything, I think that Jack the Ripper may have been a little bit younger. What I see in a lot of estimations for the Ripper's age is that a lot of people tend to think that Jack the Ripper may have been somebody who was in his late 20s to early 30s. So I don't think that anyone should dismiss a 27-year-old suspect, 28, 29. And we even see Aaron Kosminski, the prime suspect, at age 23. Even a Jack the Ripper suspect in his 20s should not be dismissed, but also in his 40s should not be dismissed either. I really think we do not have enough to know exactly where Jack the Ripper's age would have been. Charles Lechmere, a very widely discussed Jack the Ripper suspect, was 40 years old at the time. I mean, that's just on the boundary of being in his 30s. But let me know what you think. As far as 5 feet 6 inches tall, some people might disagree with this. Some people might think that this is a far-out statement, but I actually think that the Ripper may have been shorter, maybe about 5'3" or 5'4". We always have to remember that that was somewhat of an average height at the time. People were shorter back in 1888 when Jack the Ripper was committing these crimes. I think that that's the fairest way of putting it. But some other things that were shared in this first-person narrative created by Doug Lamoreux is he believed that Jack the Ripper had a limited amount of medical knowledge. He did not believe that Jack the Ripper was a medical doctor. Instead, his characterization of Jack the Ripper is Jack the Ripper was somebody who worked at a hospital. And very specifically in Saucy Jacky, the Ripper is a volunteer. He volunteers at a medical hospital, and that word volunteer is used precisely. But this is somebody who would have been exposed to lots of medical issues, someone who would have assisted with patients, who would have listened to a lot of conversations with medical doctors, but he is not a medical doctor himself. What do you think about that? I mean, I think it's totally reasonable. I think that that is as good of a guess as any into the Ripper's occupation. I am somebody who does not believe completely that Jack the Ripper had to have been a medical doctor. I mean, I tend to lean toward Jack the Ripper having anatomical knowledge, but I'm totally open to discussing suspects who do not have anatomical knowledge, because the Ripper's crimes are actually somewhat sloppy. And earlier this year, I did an episode on Dr. Thomas Bond's report, where he conducted the autopsy on Mary Kelly, and he also didn't think that Jack the Ripper had medical knowledge, but of course Mary Kelly's body was very heavily eviscerated. So this is another really interesting aspect of the profile that was created in Doug Lamoreux's Saucy Jacky, and that is that Jack the Ripper would have carried two knives. One would be a longer surgical knife that he stole from the hospital where he worked and or volunteered, and the second was a shorter pen knife. And he actually uses both knives and then ultimately finds that the shorter one is more reliable and more functioning, excuse me. So I think that this is a very interesting part of the story where you actually have the character of Jack the Ripper in Doug Lamoreux's Saucy Jacky working at the hospital, and a victim comes in, and her name is Emma Elizabeth Smith, and he sees her in pain, he sees her in agony, and he actually gets very stimulated by it. For some reason, he just feels a certain type of stimulation from listening to her screams and her moans, and this is something that prompts him and encourages him to commit murder in the future. Very clearly, he is stating that Jack the Ripper did not murder Emma Smith in the spring of 1888, but he did witness her, and it's a little bit similar to the Murder in the Air episode that I did, where certain crimes influenced other crimes in a type of snowball effect. Well, it'd really just be the first Whitechapel victim, Emma Smith, who was attacked in the spring of 1888. She is actually able to make it to the hospital, and again, someone working in the hospital heard her screaming and saw her in misery, and he enjoyed it, and he decided to inflict misery upon other people. Then, in August of 1888, Jack the Ripper commits the murder of Martha Tabram, and all of that is in the book Saucy Jacky by Doug Lamoreux, where you have somebody who is directly and deliberately going out to kill. And he also carried the multiple knives with him, the two knives. And this would explain why one knife was used on Martha Tabram, and then it seems like somebody switched the knives and delivered the final blow to Martha Tabram with a second knife. So all of that is included in Saucy Jacky. But now we are getting to perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Jack the Ripper profile. And Doug Lamoreux, like many, believes that Jack the Ripper did not grow up with a father figure. I mean, I think John Douglas has talked about this. Dr. Todd Grande definitely talked about it, where they think that he had absolutely no father figure in his life, and that he grew up only around women and developed animosity toward women. And in the book Saucy Jacky by Doug Lamoreux, very clearly he is growing up with his aunt and his mother. There are two women that have raised Jack the Ripper, and then Jack the Ripper grows up to just have an absolute distaste and scorn for women, but particularly for prostitutes. And all of this is included in the book Saucy Jacky. Some things are very, very graphic and very, very insulting to women. Like, for example, when Jack the Ripper is thinking that people are calling women who work on the streets as unfortunates. He's like, they're not unfortunates, they're whores. But this is something that I also experienced when I was reading Stephen Hunter's book, because he was really just trying to capture the thought process of the Ripper. This is what this serial killer would be thinking, and this is the way that this serial killer would be acting. He's somebody who enjoyed the suffering of women, and somebody who had a very, very big distaste for women, specifically prostitutes. He viewed them as a little bit lower in terms of human value than other women, but it seems like he just hates women all across the board because he grew up in an unpleasant home where he did not have a father, so all of his animosity went toward women. Someone who understood a little bit about medicine because he was surrounded by people who knew a lot about medicine. He stole the knife from a hospital, and he went on to become Jack the Ripper, perhaps in his 30s and perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, thereabouts. And this is another really interesting detail that was created in Doug Lamoreux's characterization of Jack the Ripper, and that is that he states very clearly that he's an educated man. Not someone who went to a university, but an educated man, almost like the concept of someone who is very well read, but he has not had a lot of formal education. He reads a book about this, he reads a book about that. He has gathered a lot of knowledge, but he does not have formal education. What do you think about all of these descriptions?